So hi everybody, this is my second month where I am putting out a what I read. In my last video kind of explained that I think these videos are really fun to watch, so I've started making them myself. I also think that the idea of something similar to a book diary is really cool. That's something I have wanted to start, either a book diary or a book journal. And so I figured that this could just be a video format of that. So when I want to look back on what I've read throughout the year or even past years, I can look at these videos even just for my own reference to remember what I read and what my initial thoughts were. So the first book I want to talk about that I read this month was The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King by Clarissa Broadbent. I read the first of this series, which is The Serpent and the Wings of Night, in January. I really loved it. I rated it 5 stars. And so I had started the second book at the end of January and finished it in the beginning of February. So this is the first book I started with this month. In my opinion, it wasn't quite as good as the first book. I don't know if that's just because of where I was at mentally though, because I really enjoyed the first book and I was completely swept away. But with the second book, I definitely noticed myself wanting to skip over some content, feeling like there was a lot of filler. I definitely feel like the first story was more action and romance heavy, whereas the second book is more world building focused, which is interesting because it's the end of the duology, but that's kind of how I felt. And so I just personally had a little bit less interest in it, but I did rate this one 4 stars. The next book that I read this month was What Lies in the Woods. This was a really surprising read. I was very pleasantly surprised with how much I liked this book. I did rate this one 4 stars, but there are some reasons why. Story-wise, I was just very engaged with the story. I really loved the romantic subplot in this story and was not expecting that. I will say the only reason it didn't get 5 stars for me was just because of the ending. I personally didn't find that the resolution of this book was super believable. If you've read it, you might know what I'm suggesting, but I did want to give this one at least 4 stars because her writing was really good. I was very much a fan of it. I thought that the way that she wrote and built characters and the way those characters interact with other characters was really good. Her side characters were very strong. I also really liked the main character. I felt like from the beginning of the story, she did a really good job explaining to the reader how this character reacts and interacts with other people, which was very interesting. I really liked that from the beginning you could kind of see without the author explicitly having to say how she reacts, what her bad habits were, and how she could react a certain way or fall to a certain vice if a certain thing happens in her life. And so you know that kind of at the beginning of the story, and then following her throughout the story, you can anticipate how she's going to act and you feel like you really know her as a main character. So I was very pleased with this book. I would highly recommend it to others. Next book I want to talk about was Dead of Winter by Darcy Coates. I have to say I was really excited to read this one and it did disappoint me a little bit. The only other Darcy Coates book / series that I've read was her Voices in the Snow series or the Black Winter series. I loved Voices in the Snow, especially the first book. Voices in the Snow itself was so good. It was a 5-star read for me. The rest of the series, definitely not as much of my favorite, but I still read through the 4 books in the series. And I have to say, I'm not sure how other people would really feel about this book. It might have been just me. The trope or idea in this book is, that they are locked away in a cottage and it's kind of a murder mystery whodunit. I had personally never read a story like that, and I'm not sure that that type of style of story is one of my favorites. So it could have been just me. I overall rated this one 4 stars. Definitely as it got towards the middle of the book, I was very intrigued. I definitely wanted to know how it ended and who done it, but I will say that me as someone who doesn't read a lot of mystery or whodunit novels, I could kind of tell who it was all the way along the story. She definitely throws some curveballs in towards the middle and end of the book, but I had a feeling it was the person who it was from the very beginning of the story. So that was a little bit disappointing for me, but still, I really like her as an author and I did give this one 4 stars. Next, I wanted to talk about Starling House by Alex Harrow. This one was really interesting. I definitely could see some people really getting into this. For me personally, there were a couple things that kind of threw me off about the story. I do really like the story. I think it's great. It has a good romantic subplot, which I'm a huge fan of in mysteries or suspense novels. This one is a very gothic novel, which I also hadn't read before, and I think I am a very big fan of. This writing style is the most unique writing style I think I've ever seen. It's the only fiction novel that I've ever come across that has footnotes. So she did write this in a very interesting manner. I will say that her perspectives sometimes were a little bit hard to follow with this book. I know that when characters change perspectives a lot, it's very common for the author to have one chapter that's in one perspective and then one chapter that's in another perspective, and those are very differentiated. I will say with this book, she only differentiates by paragraph. So at one point you'll be one character's point of view and then you'll just switch to another. And I do kind of find that she was a little bit fluid with going back and forth out of almost first person and third person. May have just been the way I read it. I can't remember now if she actually did that or not, but sometimes it was a little confusing to follow that. As well as the footnotes, I definitely felt like the footnotes, it may have just been better for her to include that in the first person, because she used the footnotes to basically give you a background on the town or the background on the story. And I feel like if it was a first person point of view or even a third person point of view, she really could have just included that either as the narrator or as the inner dialogue of the main character or the POV character. The only other thing I wanted to add about this book, and I know I'm making a lot of comments, I really did like this one, but her writing is very eloquent. I will say that kind of startled me just as far as who the character is in this book. That's where it got even more confusing. Whether she was writing in third person or first person, I couldn't really tell, because the character herself never graduated high school, but I was a little bit thrown off by the writing style because it definitely didn't match someone who never got their GED. That's not how I would expect them to write or to think, especially using some of the words that she does. It's just very high vocabulary. There were tons of words that I had to even look up in this book, and so that just kind of mismatched from the character perspective that she was portraying. So that was the only other thing that kind of threw me off as a reader reading this novel. Overall, though, I really did like this story. It was very unique, gothic aspect to it. And like I said, I really like a good romantic subplot in a mystery or suspense novel like this one. So I would recommend this, and I did give it 4 stars. The next book I want to talk about is A Touch of Darkness. So I did read this one in one day. It was very addicting. I will say, for a very spicy novel, this is definitely the best I've read that is heavy spice. I will say, in comparison to ACOTAR, because that's really the only other good comparison that I have of another book that was high in spice that was also really good. In my opinion, I really liked this one. It has slightly less plot than ACOTAR, less world building than ACOTAR, more smut than ACOTAR, but it really meshed well. Some of the other more smutty or spicy books that I have read just really lack plot completely. And so I was very pleasantly surprised with this one. I also really like the way she describes and builds her characters. They seem very realistic, and so I really like this one. Like I said, read it all in one day, and I am currently halfway through the second book, and that is A Touch of Ruin. So I'm really liking this series. Personally, for me, I'm not a huge fan of character change of point of view throughout a series. I really like to just follow the main character's point of view. So whoever's point of view I was watching from in the first book or experiencing the book from in the first book, that's usually who I like to stick with. In this series, she does have 4 that are from the perspective of Persephone. However, she has 3 books trickled throughout that are from the perspective of Hades. For me personally, those don't interest me as much. And what I really like about the series is that it reviews the same events. So all the events that occur in book 1 from Persephone's point of view are in book 2, or book 1 of Hades' perspective. So it is nice for me, someone who doesn't like that switch up. I can just completely skip the Hades only POV side of the series and stick purely to the 4 books, which are from Persephone's point of view. Personally, for me, like I said, this book was very addicting. I was very into it. I think her writing was really good. She did make it come to life. There were still some aspects to this book that kept me from rating it 5 stars. I personally just feel like the side characters and the side plot was a little bit silly in a way. She is basically a goddess who is trying to live in the mortal world in the beginning and throughout this book. So I felt like that aspect didn't really make a ton of sense to me. I didn't really understand why she was doing that. I didn't really understand why it was still of importance to her as the series continued. So just little aspects like that that I was a little bit thrown off by in this book. She also does make some decisions that I feel like, one, I wouldn't make, so I can't really relate to her as a main character, but secondly, and this was more of my issue, is it didn't really seem true to her character. So her reactions, you know, in the first book or the beginning of the books, you know, she makes decisions in the second book that just seem to completely counteract the decisions that she was making in the beginning. So it does seem a little bit inconsistent as far as her personality or her priorities. That's the only reason this one lost a star for me, but I would highly recommend this series if you're looking for a very spicy novel. Next one I want to talk about is Nora Roberts' The Awakening. So if you guys watched my January TBR, this was included on there. This is a book club book that I had no idea, you know, what I was going into. It did get really high ratings, and it is the first Nora Roberts book that I have ever read, so I will say that. However, I pushed myself to get 50% through this book, and I just can't do it. I'm really struggling if this should be a DNF for me or if I should just push through it because I have to discuss it in book club anyways. Her style of writing actually reminded me a lot of Stephen King fairy tale, and this is another book that most people really like. I had to DNF it. I could not get through Fairy Tale by Stephen King. And I think the reasoning is the same. Stephen King's fairy tale, it definitely feels like the book is really dragging on. Like there's a lot of detail that doesn't need to be there for the plot to thicken. So that is kind of a problem for me. I really don't like that kind of thing. I really like the book to start picking up around the third point when I'm 30% through. And if it doesn't, usually I end up DNFing it. So same thing with Nora Roberts' The Awakening. I find that she's giving a lot of detail about either things that are happening in the world, small details that don't add to the story, and it's just a lot of fluff, and I really don't like fluff. For example, like she finds a dog and Nora Roberts does an entire page on just talking about what she did with the dog that afternoon and brushing the dog and what she fed the dog and tomatoes and sausage. And I'm like, why am I reading this? Like, it just doesn't contribute to the story in any way. And I think some people like that, but for her style of writing and for me, just definitely doesn't mesh. So this one I think is ultimately going to be a DNF for me. The last book that I wanted to mention reading this month was an audiobook, and this was Educated by Tara Westover. This is a memoir of her life and her experience growing up as a child who was homeschooled and was not given a lot of opportunities outside of her religious background or her educational background until she was much older. It was really interesting reading this story. She ended up going on to get a master's, and I believe she did end up getting a PhD at Harvard. So just a very interesting story to see where she came from and where she ended up, and also to read her reflections of the story. She did grow up in a very abusive situation, and you know, a lot of that abuse surrounded mental illness within her family, and in her upbringing you can really see that religion was used to justify the abuse that she, you know, was victim to as a child. And so it is a very sad story, but it is written really beautifully. So this book was very interesting. Like I said, it's a very serious memoir, but I listened to it as an audiobook and I really found it enjoyable. It was very gripping, and I would highly recommend this one to others. Overall, those were all the books that I read in February. I do believe that it was 8, including The Awakening, but like I said, I am DNFing that one probably. So it's about 7, but I was very happy with all the books I read this month. I didn't read everything that was on my TBR for February, but I did read a lot of things that weren't on my TBR. I was only anticipating reading 4 or 5 books this month, and I ended up reading 7 or 8. So it was a very successful month for me. I am moving along on my 50 books a year challenge, so that feels really good. If you guys have read any of these, I'd be really curious to hear what your comments were. Feel free to comment them below. And if you do want to see more videos like this, just give me a thumbs up. It really does mean a lot to me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in my next video.